Good evening, good evening. You're in for a treat. One of the last times I saw Marie Watt, we were standing on Pacific Avenue in downtown Tacoma. Pacific Avenue is the gateway to Mount Rainier. If you follow it, you head up to the mountain. We were standing, it was a cold morning, we're all bundled up, and we're watching this spectacular cast bronze piece of Marie's be lifted up off this flatbed truck, a piece called Blanket Stories, these interwoven piece. And as it was going up in the air, I looked up and I saw a bald eagle. That's actually not that unusual in Tacoma. You can see them when you're bicycling in the park or by the beach. But I've never seen a bald eagle invited for an art installation. And we both took it as a very special and auspicious sign. And I think that will give you a sense of the kind of magic, the sense of place and community that somehow is part of Marie's work. So, welcome. I'm delighted you chose to be with us tonight for the second in the series of 3 lectures, part of the Clarice Smith Distinguished Lecture Series in American Art. We invite an art historian, an artist, and an art critic to join us to help us better understand the exciting changes in American art and in what we define as the American experience. That's my phone going off, by the way. Which is a reminder for my housekeeping to turn your cell phones off. And also we invite you to go to the corners of the room to pose your questions, because we have a live webcast and we like to capture your questions as well as the answers. And finally, I invite you to a lovely reception upstairs in the Kogod Auditorium afterwards. In case you don't know, I have the pleasure of being the director, Stephanie Siebisch. I am the Margaret and Terry Stent director here at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and also our branch museum, the Renwick Gallery, which is the place where Marie's work was last on view before the complete building takeover that is Burning Man. So I welcome Marie back as well to the Smithsonian. She was here in 2011 as part of a program called the Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship. She was one of 14 artists in the class of 2011. A notable colleague in that class was Trevor Paglen, who you know is the subject of a special exhibition currently on view and getting terrific reviews. It's upstairs on the 3rd floor, and I recommend it to you. When Marie was here doing this fellowship, she was intrigued by the native plant drawings at the National Museum of American Indian and the knowledge associated with them from indigenous peoples. So it's nice to welcome her back. I want to tell you a little bit about her impressive background. She's a graduate of Willamette University in Salem, also attended the Institute of American Indian Arts, holds a master's in painting and printmaking at Yale University, and recently received a doctorate at Willamette in 2016. She's had notable residencies at Skowhegan and the Vermont Studio Center, and has received a number of other fellowships and awards. Again, I note a few: the Joan Mitchell Foundation in 2006, and here's one of my favorite ones, Anonymous Was a Woman Foundation Fellowship in 2007. That was just revealed in the New York Times as a woman philanthropist and artist. And the Haley Ford Family Foundation grant in 2017. She was born in Seattle, but resides in Portland. I also note that her husband, Adam McIsaac, is here, as well as her delightful parents sitting up front, Dave and Romaine Watts in attendance. Please welcome them, and let's welcome Marie to the stage.
I want to start by thanking Stephanie Stiebeck for that kind introduction and extend my gratitude to the staff at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, for your generous hospitality. I appreciate the communities you are building inside and beyond these walls. It's like something that Stephanie did in the Northwest, so it's so great to see it here in this national institution. I also want to thank Clarice Smith, who I haven't met yet, but I have a feeling she's not here tonight. Well, I want to thank Clarice Smith for supporting this annual lecture series that broadens the story about American art. I have professional formative ties to Washington, D.C., and I want to express my appreciation to past colleagues and friends from the National Gallery of Art, where I was an intern, and those at the National Museum of the American Indian, where I've exhibited. I also want to acknowledge my parents, whom I affectionately refer to as my roadies, and who are in the audience this evening. And finally, as an artist who works collaboratively, I want to acknowledge those who have shared blankets, exchanged stories, and contributed stitches. Land acknowledgement. I want to invite everyone to think for a moment about the land on which we gather, work, walk, hike, dig, and play. I would like to acknowledge that Washington, D.C. and the Smithsonian Institution are located on the traditional lands of the indigenous people who inhabited the region where the Potomac and Anacostia rivers converge, including the Piscataway and related groups, the Anacostank, the Pamunkey, the Mattapaniant, the Nanjemed, and the Texahant. Not so different from today, this site was a major cultural and political exchange place for Algonquin-speaking people who used the waterways as superhighways and trade routes. So, tonight's topic. What would the world look like if we thought of ourselves as companion species? I don't pretend to have the answer to this question, but my work does seek to forge relationships and reveal aspects of our connectedness to one another, to animals, and to the natural world. Rather than presenting work in chronological order, in this presentation, I am going to piece together themes in a way that might resemble a blanket. I was sharing with a friend this evening that they've requested that I kind of write out my presentation, and oftentimes I work more extemporaneously, so I feel like I am the host of a dinner party where I started a new recipe, and I really hope it turns out. All right, so the Iroquois creation story, first teachers. My tribe, the Seneca Nation, is one of 6 tribes that make up the Iroquois Nation. We call ourselves the Haudenosaunee, or people of the Longhouse. In our creation story, Sky Woman is pushed from a hole in the sky world where a big tree once stood. As she followed a motley crew of animals, help her settle on what becomes Turtle Island, or the continent that we also know as North America. In recognition of the role animals played in helping Sky Woman, we consider our first teachers to be animals. Our clans are also animals and acknowledge this relationship. And I am from the Turtle clan. So this is our tribe's emblem, and I think it's fun to kind of share that in Seneca tradition, historically, a 4-legged animal would marry a thing that flies, a bird, and my husband's business moniker is a crow, and he's a non-native man, and I am a turtle. So I suspect we are a good match. Dogs. I've been thinking a lot about human relationships to animals, and by extension, the natural environment. I started to wonder, what are the entry points for others to help think differently about their relationships with animals? If you don't come from a community that teaches relatedness to animals, then perhaps the best entry point might be, next slide, honey, might be our relationship with pets. To focus, I started with canines. I was drawn to canines' manifestations in art, myth, indigenous teaching, ancient and modern. My interest in dogs is multifaceted. In our tribe, we have a wolf clan, and in indigenous nations of the Pacific Northwest, there's a lot of coyote stories. And quite frankly, I'm also really interested in the intersection between breeds, mutts, res dogs, and packs. In the Seneca language, my daughters called my grandmother Aksodgowan, which means great-grandmother. And this word also translates into the word ancient one. So this blanket on this piece was on my grandmother's bed when she passed away at the age 93. And my grandparents' first language is Seneca. The Capeltine wolf. I became captivated by this image of the she-wolf nursing Remus and Romulus back to health after they were cast in the wilderness and fated to die. I am struck by the mother wolf's body, which has become a shelter. Her ribs are revealed. Oh my goodness, I have to say this again. Not only is her body a shelter, but it's actually become, a canopy for these young children. Her ribs are revealed, emaciated, and suggest that she has given everything she has to offer to nourish these twins back to life. The twins in this image look quite plump and content. The mother wolf's face looks the way I sometimes feel. You don't have to be a parent to have empathy for this expression, as I'm sure you've been there too. Her gaze is that of exhaustion. Her stance, however, is one of attention. I have a feeling this mother could become ferocious at a moment's notice. This image for me demonstrates a companion relationship, one in which humans don't have dominion over animals, but rather symbiotic relatedness. In fact, here is the inverse of dominion, instead an inanimate relationship of mother and child. You will notice in this piece, a viewer would stand nearly underneath this mother wolf's canopy. And then this piece was created while I was an artist in resident at the Rockwell Museum and the Corning Museum of Glass. And this was created in collaboration with an incredible gaffer by the name of Jeff Mack and the team at Corning. This piece, Cosmos, I decided that I would explore NASA's 10 most important contributions to space exploration in this intimately scaled meditation on the universe. It also includes birds from states where I've lived and other species that have personal significance, as well as human flying machines attached with commerce, warfare, and exploration. One visual detail that I'm particularly fond of is this, it doesn't translate so well in here. Oh, and I have a little clicker. I located some 14 karat gold vintage embroidery floss and it's like right here, and it represents the golden record from the Voyager spacecraft. And I actually really like how in that particular piece, in beadwork and weaving and basket traditions, there's this practice of kind of breaking the symmetry of within an object, and so it kind of reveals human imperfection. And so for me, that's like the one moment that's very inconsistent within the rest of the work. Mother. It is probably no accident that after looking hard and long at the image of the Capeltine wolf that I started thinking a lot about the word mother. After all, I am a mother. Next slide, please. After all, I am a mother. I come from a matrilineal society. Our enrollment rights, our clans, remember I am Turtle, and even land ownership are the domain of women in the Seneca Nation. I have also been thinking about the qualities that make up mother, not necessarily biological or gendered, but the qualities that are potentially in each and every one of us. This set me in the direction of using language or text for the first time in my work. I started by generating a stream of consciousness, words responding both to the image of the Capeltine wolf and to the word mother. As a visiting artist at the Block Museum, I shared my process with students at Northwestern University, and they also assisted in generating text. This text was then patterned with masking tape onto fabric and distributed and shared open to the community sewing circles that happened at the Block Museum, as well as at a sewing circle event with collaborating partners in Evanston. And the sewing circle had the theme of equity. This is the resulting piece, Ferocious Mother, Canis Familiaris. Like an album, there is an A-side and a B-side to this piece. The B-side includes familial names as well as the names that dogs go by. I don't know that I've attached the cadence of a voice to stitched or hand-rendered text, but I was struck by how much these text blocks felt like the extension of one's body. I realized this is what makes hand-scrawled signs so evocative and powerful. And in some ways, like I was thinking about, when you see a person holding a handmade sign, perhaps a protest sign, how it really is an extension of one's voice, how it kind of amplifies that moment. In an attempt to open up the conversation further, I felt like I needed to physically envelop myself and my audience in the mother's underbelly. This piece is 15 feet long, 12 feet tall, and 12 feet deep. It was fabricated in my studio from aromatic cedar, meaning the scent of the cedar also activates one's senses. It weighs 1.5 tons, but breaks into 30 component parts weighing from 100 to 300 pounds that can pass through a 60-inch wide door frame. I've learned from past projects. And the scale and intimacy of my work is often diminished in reproduction, so I've included images of the mother with my daughters and neighbor friend. And this is what the work looked like in progress. The funny thing is that I really need to make this bigger. I'm a fan of Nikki de St. Paul's hone figure. All right. So let's get back to A-sides and B-sides. What's going on? When I heard Marvin Gaye's song, What's Going On my car radio in the midst of my mother-focused canine explorations, I understood the song's lyrics in a way that was radically different from the past 45 years. The song was released in 1971. Previously, I had taken the lyrics at face value as a protest anthem. And this is an image of Bloody, I think it's referred to as Bloody Thursday, but it was a protest in People's Park in Berkeley. And Obie Benson from the Four Tops had, I think, seen this event and started a conversation with Marvin and then eventually Al Cleveland about this event, and it was kind of the beginning of the writing of this song. But what I heard this time when I heard this song, I heard Marvin Gaye calling mother, mother, brother, brother, sister, sister in the chorus, and then father, father. And for me, that repetition and doubling suggested Marvin Gaye is not simply invoking mother or his family, he is calling the world family. He is not only asking what is going on, but calling us to come together to create change, to listen, and to love. In the indigenous community, we have a phrase, all my relations. In a sense, Marvin Gaye, too, is calling all my relations. One thing that I love about this song is that it is as much of an anthem today as it was when Marvin Gaye self-produced it in 1971. In this piece, Declaration, mother is a name, mother is a term of endearment, and I'm looking at mine, and it also is sometimes part of an expletive. This is an image that I adore of my mother in her sun and moon phase, a project by the artist Jeffrey Mitchell, who is also represented in the American Art Collection here. Twins. After time passed on Turtle Island, Sky Woman gave birth to twins. One was born in the natural way, and the other arrived through her armpit. Sky Woman died in childbirth. Her son survived. One twin was named Sapling. He was kind and gentle. The other called Flint, for he was cold and hard. As they grew, they began populating the earth with their creations. It would be simplistic to reduce their relationship to positive and negative, or opposites. In this story, both are necessary for balance in our universe. So this image, Companionspecies listening, reminds me of my mom, who worked 27 years in Indian education. She likes to say we have 2 ears and 1 mouth so we can listen twice as hard. I think this is important because we live in polarizing times, and there is a need for us to listen to one another. At the end of the day, I like to think we complement or complete each other, similar to Flint and Sapling. I actually suspect that there is a bit of Flint and Sapling in all of us, and frankly, I think I need a little bit more Flint sometimes. This is called Companionspecies, We Are Here Now. I think of these as kind of these black bubbles, as sort of speech bubbles coming out from each canine's mouth. For me, the X is a marker, a term of an endearment, and the way in which Indigenous people historically sign treaties. Tongues. In the late 1990s, I saw this portrait of Asher Wertheimer by John Singer Sargent at the Portland Art Museum. My attention was captured by the Vermeer-like quality in this portrait, in which points of light move the viewer's eyes around the composition. This is hard because I have to look forward, but I want to look back. I really, there are, in these points of light, you notice, or if you start to think about it, the light really couldn't hit that under part of his cuff or cufflink. But my favorite part is the lower left-hand corner might all but disappear in darkness if it weren't for the unfurled tongue of Mr. Wertheimer's black-coated companion. This dog's tongue made me think of my own tongue. Could it be an emblem of our connectedness? I began to look closely at other tongues in popular culture, including that of the Hindu goddess Kali, known as the Divine Mother and Mother of the Universe, whose hands reveal aspects of creation and destruction, as well as the tongue and lip design created by John Pash for the Rolling Stones. Tongues in this context are intimate, playful, and naughty. In my studio, I started painting tongues to better understand the expression and to create a pattern for an embroidery. After a while, I had so many tongue forms, I thought they looked like petals. Thinking about them together, tongues and petals, I could see they shared a similar function. Both deliver water and nutrients that feed and sustain. This is one of the first times I used embroidery floss with thin and thick skeins in order to mimic the act of drawing, as well as used French knots to mimic aspects of painting. I'm interested in how these army blankets are used to camouflage a body into a landscape, and in a sense, I think of these blankets as a metaphor for this land. Here's a scale model of the mother wolf maquette on some tongues I was painting, and this has spiked my desire to create an ambitiously scaled tongue carpet. The performance and storytelling possibilities using this as a stage and gathering place are endless. Blankets. In my family and in the Seneca community, we give blankets to honor people who are witness to important life events. This practice is held in common with other indigenous nations. I scavenge for blankets, anything $5 and under, now I'll pay up to $10, at my local thrift shop. I set the parameter that I'd acquire anything that was wool within this price point. My decision wasn't aesthetic. As these blankets amassed, family and friends started to respond to individual blankets that reminded them of grandmothers. Childhood security blankets and family-made coverlets. Blankets are markers for memories and stories. They can also be memorials. My goal in collecting these blankets was to fold and stack them in a way that would make a ladder, a column connecting sky and earth. I like the reference to linen closets. Mine is overpacked. The conifers I grew up amidst, the totem poles of the Coast Salish and Brancusi's endless column. I also like how blankets are made from felted or spun wool roving of sheep. They are connected to this notion of first teachers and animal relations. While all the blankets are not necessarily heirlooms, I appreciate how they stick around. They are enduring records of people's lives. I look for the signs of their stories, mended spots, their shapes no longer squared, but echoing the bodies that inhabit them, satin bindings that I consider ledger-like, and the place where dreams might be captured, the occasional moth buffet, and permanent soiled marks, perhaps a rite of passage, like a birthmark or tattoo. ProtoFeminist. The Seneca Nation is a matrilineal society. I didn't know what feminism was until I went to college, and when I learned about it, honestly, I was a little bit confused. I grew up in the company and often under the direction of strong, determined, generous, and nurturing women. This prompted me to conclude I come from proto-feminist stock. And here is an image of Susan B. Anthony with Woodland's influence. I want, and I apologize to her because she does have a resemblance to George Washington too. I wanted to create a portrait that alludes to the relationship the suffragists had with Iroquois women, especially Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who lived in Seneca Falls, New York, and wrote speeches for Susan B. Anthony. It is believed that they were inspired by the rights and liberties of Iroquois women. Blanket stories. Responding to the understanding that blankets were storied objects, when I showed these works, I would include a handmade blank book containing blanket stories into which visitors were encouraged to include their own. I liked how the sculptures have a life outside the studio that is predicated on the stories people share and exchange amongst themselves. In a way, blankets are living objects. I then proceeded to work collaboratively with communities and institutions to create blanket story sculptures, of which here are a few. This project, a collaboration with the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa, is the first time where a sculpture reached this height, 36 feet, and was made entirely from blankets contributed by the community. In this image, you can see how blanket story tags were attached to the blankets. As I learned more about this site where I was working, I discovered that the word Ottawa comes from the Algonquin word adawe, which means to trade. And here's a few stories from the sculpture. This one is from James Foster Benway. I remember the first time my grandfather told me that the blankets came from sheep, and every time we went for a drive into the country, I would look for white and green striped sheep. And this comes from John Moses. This quilt was made by my grandmother Edith Anderson Montour of the Six Nations Reserve, the first Native registered nurse in Canada and a First World War veteran of the U.S. Army Nursing Corps. The quilt includes patches of her Army blanket and nurse's uniform. This quilt was used for 4 generations of the Montour and Moses families at Six Nations and is all about warmth and security and helping others. We have another one to keep forever as a family heirloom. Transportation Object Witness. In 2012, I was a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow. While exploring Seneca items in the collection at the National Museum of the American Indian, I learned that cradleboards were identified and organized by the term transportation object. I found this phrase so poetic. Still kind of gives me chills, actually, when I think about it. This term, transportation object, got me thinking about how blankets transport us, physically and metaphysically. I started to think about how art and language also have the capacity to transport us. I was dumbstruck when I found this image. It is the manifestation of a blanket as a transportation object. This 1913 photo is of a First Nations Quamacham potlatch off Vancouver Island in which the blanket is flying through the air. More accurately, it is being given by the host family, standing on the rafters, to the recipients below. A potlatch is a means for displaying wealth and social relationships in Northwest Coast and First Nations communities. It is not a potluck. Whoa, I just scooted this. It is not a potluck. In 1913, this was also an act of civil disobedience, as potlatches were banned by the Canadian and US governments between 1885 and the 1950s. And I have to say, this was kind of a slow reveal for me, because at first I just really was so focused on the blanket flying through space as a transportation object, but then when I started to realize the date of the photo, I realized that this was an act of civil disobedience. My image takes liberties from the photo in the sense that the potlatch guests are not reaching for the blankets, but they're raising their fists in a sign of community solidarity and civil disobedience. I see this piece as having resonance with social and political issues happening today. Black Lives Matters, Standing Rock and Our Water Keepers, forced separation of families, and the Flint water crisis. I included my daughters and myself as guests on the right foreground as a way of acknowledging this uncut and continuous traditions. Our family, when I was younger, we've attended some potlatches, and so I thought that it would be okay to also be a guest at this one. This blanket is a double-long Whitney Point blanket, an example of what I like to call the early tax loophole. These blankets were exported from England as one object in order to limit taxation, and then would be cut and separated on delivery to make 2 blankets. The cinematic scale of this object puts viewers in the place of being witnesses as well. Sewing circles. I introduced sewing circles to my practice in 2003. They started as a way of preparing for a show at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian at the George Gustav High location in Manhattan. I invited people over saying no sewing experience was necessary. I'll feed you and give you a small print in exchange for your stitches. You can come and go as you wish, and feel free to pass on this invitation. You're welcome to bring friends and students. I was teaching at the time at Portland Community College. I was inspired by the conversations that occur when heads are down and hands are busy at work with something as intimate as cloth. Stories flow between friends and strangers alike. I am interested in the call and response element of these sewing circles and the riffing, not unlike that of jazz musicians, rappers, and poets, that create a dynamic conversation between participants and the work which is being stitched. I appreciate how each person's stitch is unique, like a signature or thumbprint. I'm especially drawn to stitches of people who have no sewing experience because they're, incredibly expressive. It's like, it's funny, I remember when I just started sewing projects, I was actually trained more as a painter and printmaker and really started working with blankets because of how they connected to my family history. And I remember there was a point where I was trying to perfect my stitching, and then I remember a later point where I thought the earlier stitching was actually better. So that expressive quality is really important to me. It is common for threads to intersect, and for me, this is a metaphor, and really more accurately, a manifestation of our connectedness. The sewing circles include people from ages 3 to 93. The sewing circles to date, my largest sewing circle to date was at the National Gallery of Canada and drew 230 participants over the course of 3 hours. I was telling you that we call ourselves the people of the longhouse, and I love this image because I think of it as just this giant longhouse dinner table. I find that sewing circles connect us with our neighbors, friends, and strangers in a way that social media cannot. First-person interaction, you come as you are, there is no expectation to talk, but stories flow. When I started hosting the sewing circles in 2003, I didn't anticipate I'd be doing them 15 years later. But they're not a means to completing a piece. The gatherings are a work in and of themselves, defined by the participants. I am drawn to how the sewing circles are multi-generational and cross-disciplinary gatherings, and for me this echoes an indigenous model for teaching and learning. The ideal sewing circle outcome might be that people make connections with others or exchange contact information. There isn't an algorithm for measuring human connections at sewing circles, but I do have a story about a woman named Melissa Blount, that's Melissa there, at a sewing circle that I hosted in Evanston with the Block Museum and other collaborators. And Melissa's a clinical psychologist who, after participating in that sewing circle, began a project called the Black Lives Matters Witness Quilt that recognizes women and girls who've died in the Chicago area as a result of gun violence by incorporating their names into a community quilt. Melissa has connected a community of collaborating partners around this ongoing project. American art. On October 2nd, I attended a reception at the Metropolitan Museum of Art to celebrate the acquisition and opening of the Diker Collection exhibition. Astonishingly, this is the first time in the Met's history that American art has been included in the Met's American collection. What took so long? I ask. The failure to incorporate American indigenous art is part of the American story. The failure to understand that American indigenous art is part of the American story tells us something about how the so-called American story is told. What happens when American art includes indigenous art in this narrative? How does that shift the stories we tell about what it means to be American, about who belongs here and who does not? I am an artist who wants to reposition the way indigenous art is contextualized and understood. It is problematic that the first encounter many American and international tourists have with American indigenous art is shaped by stories presented in natural history, anthropology, and American Western museums. These spaces are often dimly lit, dark paneled, in a way that suggests somber, memorialized, lifeless objects. While there are exceptions and innovators in the field, and these collections certainly have a place, American art museums and contemporary art institutions have been woefully slow to acknowledge, recognize, and devote institutional resources toward this goal. I am tired of the perpetual belief that we are no longer here, no longer making, that all our creative work was in the past, that we are not living among you. My art is included in Sam's collection, and it is significant that I am here today in this American Art Museum as an American indigenous artist. My presence challenges all those terms: American, institution, and art. Veterans. When I understood blankets to be storied objects, I hesitated to use army blankets, even though I grew up with army blankets from surplus stores. They rode around in my parents' breezy 1970s station wagon. They were used for picnics, changing flat tires, covering up after skiing, and constructing childhood forts. In light of the blanket stories I was starting to learn about, military blankets became loaded objects with stories that were not mine to tell. In time, I was approached by an artist who was a veteran. He asked me about the absence of military blankets in my new body of work. This interaction with him led to my first piece using Army blankets and a casket flag. This piece, Edson's flag, is now part of the Smithsonian Museum of American Art's collection and was a gift by Drake and Michael Zorinsky. The flag in this piece was given to my grandmother upon the passing of my great-uncle Edson, who was a World War I veteran and served in the U.S. Army as an airplane mechanic. The flag is revealed and concealed, but not cut or desecrated. This piece was a tribute to Edson. This piece is a tribute to Edson, Indigenous warriors, and veterans. One thing I want to share about this piece is once when a designer was putting it in a catalog, he actually wanted to edit out that mended mark in the blanket. And I always think that those marks are so much a part of the history of the object and part of the object story, but they had to ask if, they had to get clarification, I guess is what I want to say. Bronze statuary sculpture. In 2013, I was invited to design a site-responsive outdoor sculpture for the new expansion of the Tacoma Art Museum, featuring the Haub family collection of American Western art. The result is Blanket Stories Transportation Object, Generous Ones, Trek, two intertwining columns of blankets rendered in bronze. Bronze is a practical material for an outdoor sculpture, but my intention was also conceptual. Historically, bronze is used to make busts of statesmen and military leaders. Here, it is employed to memorialize stories of everyday objects, as well as the intersection of personal and public memory. In this project, the source object is lost in the casting process. It is literally incinerated, but is transformed to a permanent marker, a memorial in its likeness. Remnants of the original object's life, photos, and stories were preserved here on a website for further reflection. I will go ahead and share this one particular story if I can. Brenda, my wife, was possibly the worst quilter in the world. However, she made me this small quilt several years ago to remind me of home. I proudly used it on a long series of cots and bunks in Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan on military deployments from Fort Lewis as a defense contractor. She loved her home in Tacoma and would have been overjoyed to know her quilt became a piece of Tacoma art. In this project, blankets came from 11 states and 3 countries and have undoubtedly crossed more territories and borders than we will ever know. Many blankets accompanied individuals and families as they journeyed west. Themes of moving, homesteading, and immigrating regularly occurred. The representation of blankets that shared stories and tributes to servicemen and women acknowledged Tacoma's proximity to the Joint Base Lewis McChord and the significance of veterans in our nation. Handmade, quilted, and crocheted blankets were also prominently represented and recognized stories of their makers, grandmothers, home ec students, mothers, sisters, and the occasional man. An assortment of baby blankets alluded to infants' arrivals in the world and a deep connection to those woven objects of security. Some blankets have been instrumental in fort building, comings of age, road tripping, and camping. Others have nurtured members of the community through illness and more memorialized loved ones who have passed on. And this website for me was a pretty important turning point in my practice because it was a way of sharing the stories, not just at the site, but then, through time and space. Crow's shadow. Crow was the beloved dog of painter Jim Labrador. When Jim co-founded Crow's Shadow Institute of the Arts, he named it in memory of his dog. Crow's Shadow is located on the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Reservation in the foothills of the Blue Mountains in northeast Oregon. Its mission is to create educational, social, and economic opportunities for the community. In 2001, it expanded its mission to include a full-time master printer and publication studio. I was introduced to CSIA in 2001 when I attended a symposium called Conduit to the Mainstream. Here is a picture of the attendees, and to put this photo in context, I was a bit starstruck. I don't know if I can name everyone, but behind me is James Luna and Joanna Bigfeather and Prudence Roberts and Edgar Heap of Birds and Tamarin Master Printer Frank Jansen, Marge Devon, Jim Lavador, Margaret Archuleta, Joe Fedderson, Truman Lowe. Wow, I'm doing pretty good. And I believe that is Kay Walking Stick. That's so great. Anyway, because of this gathering, I still sort of jokingly refer to myself as the Crow's Shadow poster child, although I'm not such a kid anymore. Almost every experience I've had in my life connects me back to relationships that are from this time and gathering. Indigenous futurism. My dad introduced me to Star Trek reruns. Star Trek. But my nerd husband, his word, not mine, and 13-year-old daughter have further cemented my appreciation for this series and for science fiction. As an adult, one thing that I appreciate about Star Trek is how the writers were able to address current events that were seemingly taboo for television by placing them within the context of the future aboard the Enterprise. This included one of the early interracial kisses on broadcast television between Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura in 1968. It was not accepted in the racist present of the 1960s, but they imagined a future where this was acceptable and then broadcast that future vision on television. My mom and father, an indigenous woman and a white man, were married before this broadcast took place. I was also a kid who saw the first rerun of Star Wars in the movie theater. And being a kid, I thought it was so cool that in my tribe we had Skywalkers too, but ours scaled iron buildings. Here's an image of Engine, a felted cave that includes indigenous storytellers from my youth, and they appear as apparitions sharing stories with ancient and modern virtues, projected in a Star Wars-inspired hologram like blue haze. And this project was a collaboration with the Fabric Workshop and Museum. This basket from the Haley Ford Museum collection is either, and it's either of California or Oregon origin, shows a star motif. Indigenous people have been looking at the stars for a long time. This piece is called Trek. In it, I reference the constellations of Pleiades, or the Seven Sisters. I am interested in how stars tie us to the past, our ancestors, the present, and to future generations. I think I heard somebody smiling, so. Beadwork. In 2016, I set out to do a project using number 11 clear glass check seed beads. These particular beads have been made on machines that have been in continual operation since the 1800s, which means that objects made by my ancestors likely share these very same machines in common with the beads I used. I was drawn to this historical connectedness. Placeholder with the beaded text Ephemeral Monument is on a double long trade blanket and the resulting work using these beads. The phrase was drawn from the writing of John Lowe and his book Imprints. Lowe reflects on the Potawatomi and indigenous presence that continues today in Chicago, despite their forced removal. And he believes this imprint is an ephemeral monument. For me, an ephemeral monument is not fixed, but present, shape-shifting, and resilient. The phrase ephemeral monument has added meaning in Washington, D.C., as a lot of monuments here document indigenous delegations in nation-to-nation diplomacy fail to represent the cachet and agency that tribal leaders and delegations brought to the table. So tonight, this ephemeral monument is dedicated not only to those who've imprinted upon this land, but to a new generation of indigenous delegates working now in the District of Columbia. And one thing you should know about this piece is that when I selected these clear beads, I was really interested in how there's this invisibility depending where you're standing in proximity to it, and it's only when you get closer where the text and beads have this visibility. Companion species calling companion species. I am a visual artist, yet I understand myself to be a custodian of stories. My work as an artist can be summarized as receiver and signal emitter. What does it mean to tell and hear shared stories? Why do people give these intimate heirloom-like objects so freely? I am interested in the kinds of stories we choose to tell, and I am interested in what those stories do, what effects they have, what kind of world they help us live in. For me, what is at stake is this: companion species calling companion species. Do we tell stories that make us forget we are companions? Or do we tell stories that call us to be companions? Companions of one another and companions of the animals with whom we share the planet, and companions of the planet herself. Companion stories repair the world. They connect humanity across space and time. They require exchange. They make us better listeners. Companion stories nurture imaginations. They can empower people, but they can also take power away, so we must be careful. We must pay attention. Companion stories can become advocates for the defenseless, for those who have been silenced, and for those who have disappeared or disbelieved. Companion stories nurture imaginations. Companion stories also call us back, bring us together, and make us mother, mother, brother, brother, sister, sister, father, father. Gordon Bettles, who is Klamath and the retired steward of the University of Oregon's Many Nations Longhouse, likes to say, "My story changes when I know your story." I think he is talking about companion stories, our collective stories that remind us of our intertwined future, that show us what happens to you happens to me. And that call to us now, we must listen. Thank you.
So we'll be taking Q&A right now. We're going to be using the mic since it's webcasted. So please, who has a question?
That was fascinating. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if working in other media, like you spoke a little bit how bronze sort of gave you insight into working with textiles and working with blankets. Did glass or the glass sculpture that you had of the she-wolf, did that give you any new insight, or did you could you kind of maybe talk about that experience? It was a favorite piece of mine. I liked it.
How the glass connected to other work. I mean, I think the one thing that I found is I think I mentioned that I was kind of trained as a painter and printmaker, and then after getting out of graduate school, I really learned that I was like more of a kinesthetic maker, object person, and so and I also I left graduate school really not wanting to paint again. I think that I had kind of felt a little needing some distance from that. And so the one thing that I really like about working with new materials or different materials is that I don't feel like they're attached with it to as many rules. But in the project with Corning, what I really loved was the collaboration. And one of the things that was actually hard for me is that I don't have an experience with glass, so my ability to collaborate was more as a person who offered my drawings and who shared stories and who could say, yes, this is what I'm after, but not necessarily that. But I will share one thing. I knew I wanted to make this big sculpture, and it was really that collaboration that kind of put in motion the first kind of three-dimensional sculpture of this nursing mother wolf. And then I was like, I can do it. Like, that was really the jumping off piece to like me thinking like, I can make this 15-foot, 12 by 12 ton and a half mother. And so that's kind of the way that material shaped that conversation. But the other thing, I did really enjoy that collaboration in a way that I didn't anticipate. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, where we also have, what's the name of Dale Chihuly and Pilchuck, I honestly haven't necessarily felt drawn to that as a material, and so I think that I think that it's really important in collaborations to just bring an openness to it, because I actually learned that I really liked the object. And one of the things I started playing around with there was like these incorporating beads with the glass. And one of the things that I realized and was told in advance is that the glass bodies might not be compatible. But one thing that I actually really liked was that conversation about incompatibility. I think that like we often talk about compatibility, but like in a way, incompatibility is a big part of our nature. And so that kind of grew out of that as well.
We have time for about 2 more questions. We do have a reception upstairs that we want all of you to enjoy. Next question.
I was wondering, as you were talking about your reluctance to use army blankets as part of your work, I remember reading how those blankets were the object of transmission of disease, knowingly from the European invaders to the native tribes. And I wondered if that was part of your thinking as you felt reluctant to use army blankets.
I don't deny that association, but I think one of the things that I really appreciate about blankets is that they're kind of these objects that in the indigenous community, we've transformed them. Like, we've transformed what their meaning is to our communities, and I guess, and that they're these kind of living and objects that kind of celebrate really important life events, that it's as important to like actually give a blanket away as an acknowledgement as it is to receive one. So I guess that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Your words are powerful and your images are stunning. My question centers on your observations of people that you've worked with in the community as you've crossed the country from West Coast to East Coast and Canada. And have you done a sewing circle in DC? And in terms of just the motivation of what brings people out, have you noticed differences of why they're participating?
I think that the collaborations, when there's a lot of participation and attendance, it is because of my collaborating institution or friends that I'm working with, and so it is that kind of community outreach. I will say that one thing that is really important to me with sewing circles, I think it's as important to go into the community as it is to have people come to an institution. I think that sometimes institutions want to, reach out to communities that they don't see at in their attendance, but I also think that that relationship has to go both ways. And I have not had a sewing circle in Washington, D.C.
All right, last question. Hi, Marie. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. It was really beautiful to see. I have a question about pattern and repetition. And so can you talk about that and how you think about that in your work?
Pattern, Heather, can you talk about that a little further?
I'm not sure if it's how you presented your work, but like even with the pattern, like from the blankets and kind of the repetition of images, like the she-wolf, I don't know, that was just something that I noticed, and so I wasn't sure if that was like a conscious kind of aspect that comes for you when you're doing your art.
It's interesting, like when I was in graduate school, I was doing very obsessive drawing, and there was a lot of kind of repetition, and I think around that time I really did start to think, realize that like one of the things that was important is like not just I think I might be in fact drawn to pattern, but I also think then like where do you break that pattern, and how does that kind of connect to other kind of indigenous art practices was really interesting to me. I just recently spent some time with Wendy Red Star, and I love how like her work really addresses, like has a lot of pattern on pattern, and I'm really drawn to that, but in a different way, in my own way. But yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all for coming tonight.